Chapter 16, Part 1 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son, Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, The Civil War, 1860 through 1865. The outbreak of Civil War, Mrs. Stowe's son enlists, Thanksgiving Day in Washington, the Proclamation of Emancipation, rejoicings in Boston, Fred Stowe at Gettysburg, leaving Andover and settling in Hartford, a reply to the women of England, letters from John Bright, Archbishop Whately, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Immediately after Mrs. Stowe's return from Europe, it became only too evident that the nation was rapidly and inevitably drifting into all the horrors of civil war. To use her own words, quote, "It was God's will that this nation, the North as well as the South, should deeply and terribly suffer for the sin of consenting to and encouraging the great oppressions of the South. That the ill-gotten wealth which had arisen from striking hands with oppression and robbery should be paid back in the taxes of war, that the blood of the poor slave that had cried so many years from the ground in vain should be answered by the blood of the sons of the best hearthstones through all the free states, that the slave mothers, whose tears nobody regarded, should have with them a great company of weepers north and south, Rachels weeping for their children and refusing to be comforted, that the free states who refused to listen when they were told of lingering starvation, cold, privation, and barbarous cruelty, as perpetuated on the slave, should have lingering starvation, cold, hunger, and cruelty doing its work among their own sons, at the hands of these slave masters with whose sins our nation had connived." Mrs. Stowe spoke from personal experience, having seen her own son go forth in the ranks of those who first responded to the President's call for volunteers. He was one of the first to place his name on the muster roll of Company A of the 1st Massachusetts Volunteers. While his regiment was still at the camp in Cambridge, Mrs. Stowe was called to Brooklyn on important business, from which place she writes to her husband under the date June 11, 1861. Quote, "Yesterday noon, Henry Ward Beecher came in, saying that the Commonwealth, with the 1st Massachusetts Regiment on board, had just sailed by. Immediately I was, of course, eager to get to Jersey City to see Fred. Sister Eunice said that she would go with me, and in a few minutes she, Hattie, Sam Scoville, and I were in a carriage driving toward the Fulton Ferry. Upon reaching Jersey City, we found that the boys were dining in the depot, an immense building with many tracks and platforms. It has a great cast-iron gallery just under the roof, apparently placed there with the prophetic instinct of these times. There was a crowd of people pressing against the grated doors, which were locked, but through which we could see the soldiers. It was with great difficulty that we were at last permitted to go inside, and that object seemed to be greatly aided by a bit of printed satin that some man gave Mr. Scoville. When we were in, a vast array of gray caps and blue overcoats was presented. The boys were eating, drinking, smoking, talking, singing, and laughing. Company A was reported to be here, there, and everywhere. At last S spied Fred in the distance, and went leaping across the tracks towards him. Immediately afterwards a blue overcoated figure, bristling with knapsack and haversack, and looking like an assortment of packages, came rushing towards us. Fred was overjoyed, you may be sure, and my first impulse was to wipe his face with my handkerchief before I kissed him. He was in high spirits, in spite of the weight of blue overcoat, knapsack, etc., etc., that he would formerly have declared intolerable for half an hour. I gave him my handkerchief, and Eunice gave him hers, with the sheer motherly instinct that is so strong within her, and then we filled his haversack with oranges. We stayed with Fred about 2 hours, during which time the gallery was filled with people, cheering and waving their handkerchiefs. Every now and then the band played inspiriting airs, in which the soldiers joined with hearty voices. While some of the companies sang, others were drilled, and all seemed to be having a general jollification. The meal that had been provided was plentiful, and consisted of coffee, lemonade, sandwiches, etc. On our way out we were introduced to the Reverend Mr. Cudworth, chaplain of the regiment. He is a fine-looking man, with black eyes and hair set off by a white havelock. He wore a sword, and Fred, touching it, asked, "Is this for use or ornament, sir?" "Let me see you in danger," answered the chaplain, "and you'll find out." I said to him I supposed he had had many and one confided to his kind offices, but I could not forbear adding one more to the number. He answered, "You may rest assured, Mrs. Stowe, I will do all in my power." We parted from Fred at the door. He said he felt lonesome enough Saturday evening on the Common in Boston, where everybody was taking leave of somebody, and he seemed to be the only one without a friend, but that this interview made up for it all. I also saw young Henry. Like Fred, he is mysteriously changed, and wears an expression of gravity and care. So our boys come to manhood in a day. Now I am watching anxiously for the evening paper to tell me that the regiment has reached Washington in safety." In November, 1862, Mrs. Stowe was invited to visit Washington, to be present at a great Thanksgiving dinner provided for the thousands of fugitive slaves who had flocked into the city. She accepted the invitation the more gladly because her son's regiment was encamped near the city, and she should once more see him. He was now Lieutenant Stowe, having honestly won his promotion by bravery on more than one hard-fought field. She writes of this visit, quote, "Imagine a quiet little parlor with a bright coal fire and the gas-light burning above the center table, about which Hattie, Fred, and I are seated. Fred is as happy can be to be with mother and sister once more. All day yesterday we spent in getting him. First we had to procure a permit to go to camp, then we went to the fort where the colonel is, and then to another where the brigadier general is stationed. I was so afraid that they would not let him come to us, and was never happier than when at last he sprang into the carriage free to go with us for 48 hours. Oh," he exclaimed in a sort of rapture, "this pays for a year and a half of fighting and hard work." We tried hard to get the 5 o'clock train out to Laurel, where Jay's regiment is stationed, as we wanted to spend Sunday all together, but could not catch it, and so had to content ourselves with what we could have. I have managed to secure a room for Fred next to ours, and feel as though I had my boy at home once more. He is looking very well, has grown in thickness, and is as loving and affectionate as a boy can be. I have just been writing a pathetic appeal to the brigadier general to let him stay with us a week. I have also written to General Buckingham in regard to changing him from the infantry, in which there seems to be no prospect of anything but garrison duty, to the cavalry, which is full of constant activity. General B. called on us last evening. He seemed to think the prospect before us was, at best, of a long war. He was the officer deputed to carry the order to General McClellan, relieving him of command of the army. He carried it to him in his tent about 12 o'clock at night. Burnside was there. McClellan said it was very unexpected, but immediately turned over the command. I said I thought he ought to have expected it after having so disregarded the President's order. General B. smiled and said he supposed McClellan had done that so often before that he had no idea any notice would be taken of it this time. Now, as I am very tired, I must close, and remain as always lovingly yours, Hattie. During the darkest and most bitter period of the Civil War, Mrs. Stowe penned the following letter to the Duchess of Argyll. Andover, July 31st, 1863. My dear friend, your lovely, generous letter was a real comfort to me, and reminded me that a year, and alas, a whole year, had passed since I wrote to your dear mother, of whom I think so often as one of God's noblest creatures, and one whom it comforts me to think is still in our world. So many good and noble have passed away, whose friendship was such a pride, such a comfort to me. Your noble father, Lady Byron, Mrs. Browning, their spirits are as perfect as ever passed to the world of light. I grieve about your dear mother's eyes. I have thought about you all, many a sad, long, quiet hour, as I have lain on my bed and looked at the pictures on my wall, one in particular of the moment before the crucifixion, which is the first thing I look at when I wake in the morning. I think how suffering is and must be the portion of noble spirits, and no lot so brilliant that must not first or last dip into the shadow of that eclipse. Prince Albert, too, the ideal knight, the Prince Arthur of our times, the good, wise, the steady head and heart we, that is, our world, we Anglo-Saxons, need so much. And the Queen! Yes, I have thought of and prayed for her too. But could a woman hope to have always such a heart, and yet ever be weaned from earth, all this and heaven too? Under my picture I have inscribed, quote, "Forasmuch as Christ also hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same mind." End quote. This year has been one long sigh, one smothered sob to me. And I thank God that we have as yet one or two generous friends in England who understand and feel for our cause. The utter failure of Christian anti-slavery England, of those instincts of a right heart which always can see where the cause of liberty lies, has been as bitter a grief to me as was the similar prostration of all our American religious people in the day of the fugitive slave law. Exeter Hall is a humbug, a pious humbug like the rest. Lord Shaftesbury, well, let him go. He is a Tory, and has after all the instincts of his class. But I saw your Duke's speech to his tenants. That was grand. If he can see these things, they are to be seen, and why can't Exeter Hall see them? It is simply the want of the honest heart. Why do the horrible barbarities of Southern soldiers cause no comment? Why is the sympathy of the British Parliament reserved for the poor women of New Orleans, deprived of their elegant amusement of throwing vitriol into soldiers' faces and practicing indecencies inconceivable in any other state of society? Why is all expression of sympathy on the Southern side? There is a class of women in New Orleans whom Butler protects from horrible barbarites that up to his day have been practiced on them by these so-called New Orleans ladies, but British sympathy has ceased to notice them. You see, I am bitter. I am. You wonder at my brother. He is a man and feels 1,000 times more than I can, and deeper than all he has ever expressed, the spirit of these things. You must not wonder, therefore. Remember, it is the moment when every nerve is vital. It is our agony. We tread the wine-press alone, and they, whose cheap rhetoric has been for years pushing us into it, now desert en masse. I thank my God I always loved and trusted most those who do now stand true, your family, your Duke, yourself, your noble mother. I have lost Lady Byron. Her great heart, her eloquent letters would have been such a joy to me. And Mrs. Browning, oh, such a heroic woman. None of her poems can express what she was, so grand, so comprehending, so strong, with such inspired insight. She stood by Italy through its crisis. Her heart was with all good through the world. Your prophecy that we shall come out better, truer, stronger, will, I am confident, be true, and it was worthy of yourself and your good lineage. Slavery will be sent out by this agony. We are only in the throes and ravings of the exorcism. The roots of the cancer have gone everywhere, but they must die. Will. Already the confiscation bill is its natural destruction. Lincoln has been too slow. He should have done it sooner, and with an impulse. But come it must, come it will. Your mother will live to see slavery abolished, unless England forms an alliance to hold it up. England is the great reliance of the slave power today, and next to England the faltering weakness of the North, which palters and dare not fire the great broadside for fear of hitting friends. These things must be done, and sudden, sharp remedies are mercy. Just now we are in a dark hour, but whether God be with us or not, I know he is with the slave. And with his redemption will come the solution of our question. I have long known what and who we had to deal with in this, for when I wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, I had letters addressed to me showing a state of society perfectly inconceivable. That they violate graves, make drinking cups of skulls, that ladies wear cameos cut from bones, and treasure scalps, is no surprise to me. If I had written what I knew of the obscenity, brutality, and cruelty of that society down there, society would have cast out the books. And it is for their interest, the interest of the whole race in the South, that we should succeed. I wish them no ill, feel no bitterness. They have had a Dahomean education, which makes them savage. We don't expect any more of them, but if slavery is destroyed, one generation of education and liberty will efface these stains. They will come to themselves, these states, and be glad it is over. I am using up my paper to little purpose. Please give my best love to your dear mother. I am going to write to her. If I only could have written the things I have often thought. I am going to put on her bracelet, with the other dates, that of the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. Remember me to the Duke and to your dear children. My husband desires his best regards, my daughters also. I am lovingly ever yours, H.B. Stowe. Later in the year we again hear from her son in the army, and this time the news comes in a chaplain's letter from the terrible field of Gettysburg. He writes, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Saturday, July 11th, 9:30 p.m. Mrs. H.B. Stowe. Dear Madam, among the thousands of wounded and dying men on this war-scarred field, I have just met with your son, Captain Stowe. If you have not already heard from him, it may cheer your heart to know that he is in the hands of good, kind friends. He was struck by a fragment of a shell which entered his right ear. He is quiet and cheerful, longs to see some members of his family, and is, above all, anxious that they should hear from him as soon as possible. I assured him I would write at once, and though I am wearied by a week's labor, here among scenes of terrible suffering, I know that, to a mother's anxious heart, even a hasty scrawl about her boy will be more than welcome. May God bless and sustain you in this troubled time. Yours with sincere sympathy, J. M. Crowell. The wound in the head was not fatal, and after weary months of intense suffering it imperfectly healed, but the cruel iron had too nearly touched the brain of the young officer, and never again was he what he had been. Soon after the war his mother bought a plantation in Florida, largely in the hope that the out-of-door life connected with its management might be beneficial to her afflicted son. He remained on it for several years, and then, being possessed with the idea that a long sea voyage would do him more good than anything else, sailed from New York to San Francisco around the Horn. That he reached the latter city in safety is known, but that is all. No word from him or concerning him has ever reached the loving hearts that have waited so anxiously for it, and of his ultimate fate nothing is known. Meantime, the year 1863 was proving eventful in many other ways to Mrs. Stowe. In the first place, the long and pleasant Andover connection of Professor Stowe was about to be severed, and the family were to remove to Hartford, Connecticut. They were to occupy a house that Mrs. Stowe was building on the bank of Park River. It was erected in a grove of oaks that had in her girlhood been one of Mrs. Stowe's favorite resorts. Here, with her friend Georgiana May, she had passed many happy hours, and had often declared that if she were ever able to build a house, it should stand in that very place. Here, then, it was built in 1863, and as the location was at that time beyond the city limits, it formed, with its extensive, beautiful groves, a particularly charming place of residence. Beautiful as it was, however, it was occupied by the family for only a few years. The needs of the growing city caused factories to spring up in the neighborhood, and to escape their encroachments, the Stowes in 1873 bought and moved into the house on Forest Street that has ever since been their northern home. Thus, the only house Mrs. Stowe ever planned and built for herself has been appropriated to the use of factory lands, and is now a tenement occupied by several families. Another important event of 1863 was the publishing of that charming story of Italy, Agnes of Sorrento, which had been begun nearly 4 years before. This story suggested itself to Mrs. Stowe while she was abroad during the winter of 1859–60. The origin of the story is as follows. One evening at a hotel in Florence, it was proposed that the various members of a party should write short stories and read them for the amusement of the company. Mrs. Stowe took part in the literary contest, and the result was the first rough sketch of Agnes of Sorrento. From this beginning was afterwards elaborated Agnes of Sorrento, with a dedication to Annie Howard, who was one of the party. Not the least important event of the year to Mrs. Stowe and the world at large through her instrumentality was the publication in the Atlantic Monthly of her reply to the address of the women of England. The reply is substantially as follows. January 1863. A reply. To the affectionate and Christian address of many thousands of women of Great Britain and Ireland to their sisters, the women of the United States of America. Signed by Anna Maria Bedford, Duchess of Bedford, Olivia Cecilia Cowley, Countess Cowley, Constance Grosvenor, Countess Grosvenor, Harriet Sutherland, Duchess of Sutherland, Elizabeth Argyle, Duchess of Argyle, Elizabeth Fortescue, Countess Fortescue, Emily Shaftesbury, Countess of Shaftesbury, Mary Ruthven, Baroness Ruthven, M.A. Milman, wife of Dean of St. Paul, R. Buxton, daughter of Sir Thomas Fowell Buxton, Carolina Amelia Owen, wife of Professor Owen, Mrs. Charles Wyndham, C.A. Hatherton, Baroness Hatherton, Elizabeth Ducey, Countess Dowager of Ducey, Cecilia Park, wife of Baron Park, Mary Ann Shelley, wife of the Lord Mayor of London, E. Gordon, Duchess Dowager of Gordon, Anna M. L. Melville, daughter of Earl of Leven and Melville, Georgiana Embrington, Lady Embrington, A. Hill, Viscountess Hill, Mrs. Gobat, wife of Bishop Gobat of Jerusalem, E. Palmerston, Viscountess Palmerston, and others. Sisters, more than 8 years ago you sent to us in America a document with the above heading. It is as follows, quote, "A common origin, a common faith, and we sincerely believe a common cause, urge us at the present moment to address you on the subject of that system of Negro slavery which still prevails so extensively, and even under kindly disposed masters, with such frightful results in many of the vast regions of the Western world. We will not dwell on the ordinary topics, on the progress of civilization, on the advance of freedom everywhere, on the rights and requirements of the 19th century, but we appeal to you very seriously to reflect and to ask counsel of God how far such a state of things is in accordance with his holy word, the inalienable rights of immortal souls, and the pure and merciful spirit of the Christian religion. We do not shut our eyes to the difficulties, nay, the dangers that might beset the immediate abolition of that long-established system. We see and admit the necessity of preparation for so great an event, but in speaking of indispensable preliminaries, we cannot be silent on those laws of your country which, in direct contravention of God's own law, instituted in the time of man's innocency, deny in effect to the slave the sanctity of marriage, with all its joys, rights, and obligations, which separate, at the will of the master, the wife from the husband, and the children from the parents. Nor can we be silent on that awful system which, either by statute or by custom, interdicts to any race of men, or any portion of the human family, education in the truths of the gospel and the ordinances of Christianity. A remedy applied to these two evils alone would commence the amelioration of their sad condition. We appeal to you, then, as sisters, as wives, and as mothers, to raise your voices to your fellow citizens, and your prayers to God for the removal of this affliction and disgrace from the Christian world. We do not say these things in a spirit of self-complacency, as though our nation were free from the guilt it perceives in others. We acknowledge with grief and shame our heavy share in this great sin. We acknowledge that our forefathers introduced, nay, compelled the adoption of slavery in those mighty colonies. We humbly confess it before Almighty God, and it is because we so deeply feel and unfeignedly avow our own complicity that we now venture to implore your aid to wipe away our common crime and our common dishonor." End of chapter 16, part 1. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.